This lecture is going to cover gross anatomy of the brain. We've actually discussed several aspects about the organization of the nervous system in general. What we haven't covered are the anatomical planes, directions, and orientation, which we'll cover slightly here. So first, let's take a look at the planes of the human brain. Here you can see that the brain can be divided into a coronal plane, horizontal plane, and a sagittal plane. When looking at the brain in this format, here is the frontal lobe, here is the occipital lobe, parietal would be up here, and the temporal lobe would be here. These planes are the most common ways in which the brain is sliced upon dissection or when taking an MRI or a CT scan. So looking at the coronal plane, this is also referred to as a frontal plane. In this perspective, it slices the brain parallel to the face. One might also say that it cuts the brain into front and back portions. Here we see the horizontal plane, also referred to as a transverse plane. Here, slices of the brain are considered to be parallel to the horizon when the person is standing in an upright position. You can also think about it dividing the brain into upper and lower portions. I like to remember transverse cutting the brain into a top and bottom portion. Lastly, we have the sagittal plane. The sagittal plane cuts slices that are parallel to a vertical plane. When you divide in a sagittal plane, it cuts the brain into right and left portions. When that plane is directly in the middle of the brain, cutting the brain into equal right and left halves or portions, then it is considered a mid-sagittal plane. Lastly, I want to mention a cross-section. Cross-sections are slices that are cut at right angles to a long, narrow axis, such as the spinal cord. So, if you were to imagine the spinal cord extending from here, anything that is cut at a right angle to the spinal cord would be considered a cross section. Let's talk a little bit about the directions with respect to a quadruped, which you see here, versus a biped, a human being who has 2 feet rather than 4 feet. So directions are described taking into account the orientation of the brain relative to the spinal cord. So if we look at the quadruped here, the orientation of the brain relative to the spinal cord, everything is pretty much on one fluid plane, on the same plane. When we look at the human being, you have a spinal cord, which is not perfectly straight, but then you have a brain which almost sits more in a horizontal direction on top of the spinal cord, which runs more vertically. When we discuss terms and directions in the nervous system, they do have different meanings depending upon whether you're discussing them within a quadruped or within the biped. So again, in the quadruped, you have a spinal column that runs horizontally, pretty much consistent with the brain, versus the biped who has a vertical spinal cord and a brain that's not exactly fully in line with it, because the way the brain sits, it actually is more horizontal than it is fully in line with the spinal cord. We're going to first look at the terms within a quadruped because they are slightly more straightforward. So if we look at the quadruped here, the term anterior. Anterior refers to towards the nose only when we are looking at the quadruped. Some people might also talk about or use the terms caudal, caudal, caudal or cranial in this orientation. So anterior, meaning toward the nose, versus posterior, which tends to mean towards the tail or towards the rostral region. rostral, also known as rostral. Then you have dorsal. Dorsal refers to above the spinal cord. So dorsal refers to the back, okay? And it's above the spinal cord. So towards the surface of the back. And then ventral in the quadruped refers to towards the belly, below the spinal cord, okay? So again, dorsal refers to above the spinal cord. Ventral refers to below the spinal cord. But you can also use the term towards the stomach. Okay, whoops, I'm frozen here. Towards the stomach when we think about the ventral region. If you think about the term medial, it means towards the midline, and the term lateral would be towards the sides. So you could say that the tail is more medially located when compared to the legs, which are more laterally located. Now let's take a look at those directions when in a biped. So again, with the biped, we have the spinal cord running vertically and the brain sitting on top of it more in a horizontal position. If you go back to this slide, so you look at this really sits more horizontally than it does vertically. So in the human, the terms change slightly. So we first talked about anterior here and posterior here on the quadruped, referring to the head and the feet regions, sort of, right? More head and tail. But if we look at the terms anterior and posterior in the biped, they change, right? Anterior does not mean towards the head. Anterior and ventral become synonymous in the biped. So anterior and ventral are synonymous, and posterior and dorsal become synonymous in a biped, whereas those terms are distinctly different when looking at the quadruped. Anterior, posterior, ventral, dorsal. Other terms we need to look at include superior. Now, superior refers to towards the head, or we also will use the terms to refer to upper or higher. Inferior is away from the head or towards the feet. Inferior might also be used to refer to something as being under or lower when compared to something else. And we can still use the terms proximal and distal. Proximal is usually used in reference to the limbs. So we can talk about the point of attachment. The shoulder, for example, is more proximally located than the fingers or hand, which are more distally located. So proximal is towards the center of the body or the point of attachment. Distal is away from the point of attachment. Let's also include the terms superficial here. So superficial means towards the surface. Deep means away from the surface. So if you've ever run, tripped, scraped a knee, that's a superficial injury, versus if you've ever stepped on a nail or something that punctured your foot or your hand, that would be considered deep, away from the surface. Let's also look at the sides of the nervous system. So all humans have two sides that are for the most part symmetrical. Nearly all of the structures that we have come in pairs. except for a few, such as the pituitary gland, which lies directly in the midline of the brain. So the term unilateral refers to things that are present on one side of the body. Bilateral, you're referring to things on both sides of the body. So for example, someone after having a stroke might have weakness on one side of their body. We would refer to that as a unilateral hemiparesis. However, when something occurs on both sides of their body, again, we refer to that as bilateral. So, surprising as this may sound, I had a mountain biking accident and I broke both my wrists. Yes, imagine that. I broke both wrists. So, I was described as having bilateral wrist fractures occurring on both sides. We can also talk about the terms ipsilateral and contralateral when we talk about neural signals. So when a signal is being sent from the brain to somewhere else in the body. Ipsilateral signals come from a structure on one side of your body and end up in a structure on that same side of the body. So for example, sensory information. Let's say sensory information coming in the right side of your body. If it makes a stop in the cerebellum, it also goes to the cerebellar hemisphere on the right side. So sensory information that goes to the cerebellum is received on the right side of the body and it goes to the ipsilateral right cerebellar hemisphere. You don't need to understand the pathway, just understand that when it's the right side of the body going to the same right hemisphere, that is ipsilateral. We can also talk about contralateral signals. These are signals that come from a structure on one side of your body, but go to a structure on the opposite side of the body. So for example, the right side of your brain controls movements on the left side of your body. In order for the right side of your brain to control the movements on the left side of your body, those nerves or neurons must cross midline at some point in order to innervate those structures on the opposite side. When pathways, nerves, fibers, axons cross midline, we say that they decussate. They cross over from the right half to the left half, or from the left half to the right half, depending where they originated. In the developing vertebrate, the neural tube, that is Neural, neural tube, is the embryo's precursor to the central nervous system. So a full-term pregnancy is 40 weeks. For brain development, the most critical time is during the 3rd and 4th weeks of gestation because that's when the neural tube is forming. So if you think about that, most people don't even realize that they're pregnant until about the 4th week. That's why it's so important if you're trying to get pregnant that you do everything in terms of prenatal care. Not drinking, not smoking, taking your vitamins, etc. Because during the 3rd and 4th weeks of gestation, that's when the neural tube is forming. So the encephalon is another term for brain. The prosencephalon, as it develops, so as the brain continues to develop, the prosencephalon becomes the telencephalon. The mesencephalon continues developing as the midbrain, and the rhombencephalon becomes the metencephalon and the myelencephalon. Now, all of these terms are on the next slide. I know there are a lot of terms there, and they're not that easy. So again, the brain or the neural tube starts as the prosencephalon, the mesencephalon, and the rhombencephalon. And as that neural tube grows, these portions develop into other parts of the brain that we're going to take a look at now. So again, the brain, also referred to as the encephalon. We have the telencephalon, which started as the prosencephalon. This continues to become the cerebral hemispheres. It includes the basal ganglia, and it includes the rhinencephalon. We will discuss this structure later, the rhinencephalon, as we delve into the limbic system. Literally, the term rhinencephalon means nose brain. We also have the diencephalon. So the diencephalon started as the prosencephalon. The diencephalon includes the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The mesencephalon, becomes the midbrain. The metencephalon includes the pons and cerebellum. The metencephalon started as the rhombencephalon. And the myelencephalon also started as part of the rhombencephalon, and this becomes the medulla oblongata. So one might ask, well, where is the brainstem within all of these structures? Well, the mesencephalon, includes the midbrain plus the pons. So the brainstem is midbrain, pons, and medulla. So we have the midbrain from the mesencephalon, the pons from the metencephalon, and the medulla oblongata from the myelencephalon. So all of those develop to become the brainstem. So one more time, the brainstem includes the mesencephalon, or the midbrain from the mesencephalon, the pons from the metencephalon, and the medulla from the myelencephalon. And then, of course, we have the spinal cord. So let's look a little more closely at the telencephalon, the brain. We're going to spend some time discussing important regions of the cerebral hemispheres before we go on to discuss the basal ganglia. So first, what you see here is the brain, The brain, or the cerebrum. This region here is the cerebrum and contains most of the brain matter. Again, we can refer to this as the encephalon. It's gray in color, weighs 3 pounds, give or take. That is redundant from earlier lectures. We already discussed the fact that there are gyri and sulci, the gyri being the convolutions, and the sulci, the fissures or grooves. Remember that gyri and sulci allow for more cortical space, so that more cortex can fit within the small skull. The telencephalon can be divided into the two hemispheres, our right and left hemispheres. So the cerebrum divided into the right and left hemispheres, which is further divided into 4 lobes. So each hemisphere is divided into 4 lobes, which we will discuss. There is a large mass of white matter that connects the right and left hemispheres. This structure is called the corpus callosum. This is not the only band of fibers that connects the two hemispheres, but it is the largest band of fibers that connects the two hemispheres. The two hemispheres, left and right, are not exactly symmetrical in nature. Most people have a larger left than right hemisphere. Any guesses as to why that might be? If you said it's because for most people, language is housed in the left hemisphere, then you would be correct. Also of interest is that 90% of people are left hemisphere, language dominant. So 90% of people are left hemisphere language dominant. Approximately 60% of left-handed individuals are still left hemisphere dominant for language. There's a misnomer that if you write with your left hand or are left-handed dominant, then language must be in the right hemisphere. That has to do with contralateral control, but that is not a true statement. So 60% of left-handed individuals are still left hemisphere dominant for language. Okay, so we talked about the corpus callosum. Okay, the corpus callosum is the largest set of commissural fibers. So commissural fibers connect areas between the two hemispheres, whereas association fibers connect two areas within the same hemisphere, right? So an example, again, of the commissural fibers is the corpus callosum. An example of association fibers that connect two regions within the same hemisphere would be the arcuate fasciculus. The arcuate fasciculus connects what would be Broca's area to Wernicke's area. Okay, so whoops. Here's frontal lobe, here's the cerebellum. So here would be Wernicke's area, and then under this gyri would be Broca's area. Okay, so you can see the fibers connecting there. So, two hemispheres, four lobes. We will look at the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes momentarily. They are connected by different tracts or fibers. So even though the corpus callosum is the largest commissural fibers connecting the two hemispheres, it is not the only band of fibers connecting the two hemispheres. And of course, the arcuate fasciculus is not the only band of fibers connecting two regions within the same hemisphere.